Welcome to Insights in Touch, the podcast where industry insight meets meaningful conversation. Hosted by Kristin Thorne, this series, presented by iFraud Foundation, explores the real issues facing the property and casualty insurance world. It's the pulse of an industry under pressure and the voices working to protect its future. Stay informed, stay connected, stay in touch. Now, here's your host, Kristin Thorne.
All right, today on the Insights in Touch podcast, and I'm so happy to be back with this great interview, Daniel Johnston, Supervising Partner at the Willis Law Group. And Dan, you are one of the smartest attorneys I know for a fact, in addition to your boss, Kirk Willis, who is just amazing. So today we're going to get deep into the fraud. We're going to get into the financials, really what is driving this. I want you to talk about what you've uncovered, why it's important, and why people should care and why we don't hear more of it. Go ahead, Dan. What are we going to talk about?
Thanks again for the introduction. I very much appreciate the kind words. I'm not actually that smart. I just pretend to be. No one's caught me yet. I did want to talk today about exactly what you mentioned, sort of what is this driving force that's taking place behind the scenes, and why is it not dragged in the light more often? Why do people not know about it, care about it? And I think the answer is frankly an easy one, which is it's very boring. It's very boring. It involves structured finance. It involves securities. It involves collateralizing and securitizing multiple debt obligations that are backed by assets. It's stuff that puts people to sleep. But it is also the very engine that's driving what you see at the ground level during what everyone has been calling the fraudemic. The cases that arise with people not really hurt, the totally unnecessary surgeries that people are getting for no reason other than to justify increasing returns. The same very things that Governor Hochul has just spoken about twice in the last month. Not for nothing about cases involving law firms and surgeons who appear to be just intending to increase artificially the value of cases and go after insurance companies. And that's sort of the other end of it, is because who's really the victim in terms of what's immediately in front of people's eyes when they see a case like this. They see it as, oh, well, the insurance company, whatever. It's the insurance company. And I hear that and I get that, but the problem is, and as Governor Hochul's rightly zoned in on, the insurance company taking on massive fraudulent losses directly leads to the increased cost of living and increases for insurance across the board for everyone. It drives up costs of healthcare. It drives up costs of just businesses doing business, which increases costs to everything. It's not just it increases your auto premiums, your house insurance. It increases the cost of your price of goods. You go to the grocery store, things are more expensive because everyone and their grandmother's slipping on blueberries in aisle 6. Like
And
that's
yogurt.
related.
Yogurt. I think I have a yogurt case that I've seen. So Dan, so look, this is a business. This is funding these lawsuits is as much of a business as anything else. And, it is unfortunate that the insurance companies get yelled and screamed at for everything, and yet they're not looking at the incredible amount of profit that is being made. Take us through, and I know you are, obviously this excites you. It may be boring to some people, and I want you to tell me about why you find this so interesting. Take me through what are we talking about here? What level of finances is behind this?
I'm going to walk you through sort of how this works, and that'll go and show kind of how this scales from what seems to be isolated incidents into literally a multinational private equity-backed endeavor. So you have somebody who just, maybe they got recruited by their buddy, whatever the case may be. They say, listen, all you got to do is go, we're going to bring you over to this spot where we know that there's this crack that hasn't been addressed. You're going to just walk past like you're walking, take a stumble, take a fall. You're going to go to the hospital. You're going to tell them that your shoulders hurt, your back hurts, your neck hurts, your knees hurt. And then they're going to get you on, the Ferris wheel. You're going to get hooked up with attorneys. You're going to get hooked up with a clinic who's going to send you for MRIs that we already know what they're going to say. We're going to send you to surgeons who are willing to do surgery because they're also getting upfront funding, which we'll get to in a little bit. And as long as you play ball, we're going to get you some money now, a lot of money now. And on top of that, you've got the potential to get a lot of money down the line. And, a lot of times these amounts are not nothing. And for people who are very often non-English speaking, undocumented, day laborers who are making sometimes less than minimum wage, they get offered to, you got to show up, do this thing, show up where we tell you we're going to be 15 grand right now. That sounds pretty good. Um, and you can take more, by the way. If you need more, let us know. We'll get you more. Um, so, okay, you
But
have
we've
some.
seen sometimes when they don't do that, if the person is not following what the law firm wants them to do, it can end up being backfiring. And they'll say, well, I need more money, but you got to do this, you got to do that. So and I think that's surprising, Dan, to people when we tell them that, there's money up front for people. When we start telling people that, they're like, really? Yes, that's part of it. And in theory, it's meant to support the worker while he or she is going through the litigation, to support them, their rent, their food. That is the theory. And in good spirit, it makes sense, but unfortunately it has been usurped.
It's an important distinction because I do want to be clear. The entire concept of litigation funding is not in itself an inherently bad thing. And in theory, and in the way some funders do operate, it is not a bad thing. They do things ethically. They are utilized for what their purpose is, which is some extra money to get by while you can't work or whatever the case may be. But that is unfortunately not what has become the lion's share of the funding that's taking place specific to the injury realm, and specific to general liability and workers' comp situation specifically, where it is currently thriving. So that's sort of the perspective from the individual person who gets pulled into this, whatever the case may be. By the way, I also have contracts that explicitly spell out they get an extra X amount post-surgery, which speaks for itself. So that's what the one person sees, and that's what they get. And then out of the recovery of the funds, when they ultimately settle or win a verdict, whatever the case may be, the interest rates are astronomical, but that's expected because they're supposed to be non-recourse loans well, not loans, advances. And so if I lose, well, I'm bearing the risk of not getting my money back. Therefore, I'm entitled to charge more than a standard lender. All sounds great in theory, again. So you have that one person's case, and they take out X amount of money, which is now subject to X amount of wild and, interest rates, which they'll ultimately recover down the line. That's just one person. That funding company has done the same thing. And by the way, most of the time, that same person who recruited their buddy to get involved is also the person kicking it over to the funding company and getting a piece of it as an originator, a broker, whatever the case may be. And it's a lot of times written right into the contract. Yeah, origination fee, distribution, 5 grand to whatever LLC. Yeah, that's his buddy's LLC. So they're doing this hundreds, thousands of times over the course of a year, right? Now, what they're doing is they're then taking all of those advances and they're putting them into one pot, and they're securitizing them in a few different ways. Some of them will be structured as its own entity, as a special purpose vehicle that's an investment company that can be invested in, and then entitling the investors to the returns. Some are packaged into notes. That seems to be the most common way to go, is a company will aggregate all of these advances and put it into a projection of this pool of advances is, scheduled to return X amount over the next several years. Why don't you investors buy my right to these receivables, these aggregated receivables at X amount of, I get a portion of what the expected profit is, and they're basically buying out the principal and an additional portion of that profit. So the funder is essentially selling off their book in real time as they're aggregating these advances, which then entitles them to go right back to the field and now fund a ton more advances and to fuel that next note. So that's the flywheel. It's a snowball. You get the advances out there, you then package them up, sell them off to investors at rates and amounts that are higher than what you put out. Then you take that new money that you just got and put that money out on the street, and you just reiterate.
How do you know this to be true? What, people will say, well, you're not that you're just a lawyer, but you know what I mean. How do you know?
How do I know? I know because I have documentation. This is not secret. This is not a secret. Some of these places, depending on how they structure them, they have to file documents with the SEC, and they have. And I have those documents. I know where the funds are coming from. I know which originator is putting together the, street level advances that are going out. I know how the structure works where they're kicking it up to the parent company that's paying them out. So they're getting paid off. And then I have the documentation for the offerings that they're making to the investors. And I also have the UCC assignments. I have the assignments of the receivables, tracking it all the way up the chain. And it's not just through private sales to outside investors. A number of these funds are now doing business directly where they're packaging these loans together and then issuing debt products or investment products that are now held by pension funds. They're held by mutual funds. They're sitting in people's portfolios and they don't even know it. It's
I was going
honestly,
to add, why should people care? It seems like you're about to touch on that.
depending on what you have in your portfolio, there's a number of registered mutual funds, pension funds, that are out there that have large amounts of this paper, this invested notes, these invested pools that are sitting on their holdings. So if you're invested in, X, Y, or Z mutual fund and it owns a huge amount of, aggregated debt that's coming from these advances, believe it, you're directly invested in the fraudemic. And it's actually a negative for you if the whole thing gets blown up.
How can you figure this out? How can one inquire? You
Let's
call
walk it up.
your
I'll walk it up using an example as basically I feel fine doing it because a lot of this has already been laid out in one of the RICOs that was filed. So you have Best Case Funding. They're a funding company that does cash advances for injury plaintiffs. And that was in conjunction with a law firm, Subin, that, the ongoings of both of those entities is well known. I don't have to jump too far into it. But for our purposes, Best Case is funding a ton, if not all, of the claimants who are coming in the door through certain sources. So Best Case runs the money out the door. Best Case then assigns that the right to those receivables to its Delaware entity, which is Best Case Originations D LLC. Best Case Originations D then assigns its right to those receivables to a special purpose vehicle that he created called RL SPV, which is intentionally amorphous and ambiguous. RL SPV is sitting in a registered mutual fund as one of its core holdings. So all of the right to the ultimate recovery of these cases in the aggregate is not going to, a shady company in a strip mall that claims to be a funder. It's running all the way up the chain to registered mutual funds being handled by, financial advisors that are being offered as investments to the public that are sitting in pension funds and retirement funds and IRAs and 401ks. It's not a matter of speculation, it's a matter of documentation. It's happening. On top of that, that same fund that owns a ton of, the ultimate best case assigned receivables also owns a ton of something called 888 Fund. 888 Fund is a company that specializes in advancing the attorney's receivables. So you can sit there and say and put your cases into an inventory, a stockpile, bring them to a financier, say, I'm expecting to make XYZ out of these cases, and they'll extend you a credit line based on just the case inventory you have. And by the way, just like anything else, it's a matter of checking boxes to determine valuation. So, okay, how do I value these cases you have? Well, how many surgeries did they have? What kind of surgeries? Well, that's kind of a great incentive right there to start making my guys go out and get surgeries regardless of the merit of the case. I'm directly increasing my own credit line. Here's where it gets real bad. If you have an attorney who is getting his ongoing cash liquidity from 888 Fund, representing clients who are getting their advances from Best Case and in turn that mutual fund. If that mutual fund sits on top of both, you've got the same people who are ultimately the control people and the ultimate beneficiaries of a case, receiving both the attorney's fees on a case and the client's ultimate recovery on a case. And then I'll do you one better. because
Oh, great.
those medical providers who very often directly get funding from the plaintiffs, litigation finance, they'll cut them a check. Most of them don't do that for the entire value of the surgeries or whatever they're owed from the case. They'll take upfront funding for a portion of it, but then they'll still assert a lien saying, I am directly entitled to receive X amount out of the recovery. So let's say it's $100,000 total for a surgery. I'll get upfront funding for 40, sure, I'll get that check. But then I'm going to assert a right to collect 60 out of the ultimate recovery. Now, here's what I can
And
do
then
as the doctor. I can throw that into my own pot of receivables, which I can turn around and use to secure a credit line and get cash today. Which, by the way, if you follow that chain up, guess where it leads? The mutual funds, the registered funds, the pension funds, all of
I mean,
this is
we
just
wonder why plaintiffs at the end of all of this, they're just the guinea pigs. They're just the ones they don't even see really. And yes, they get some money, but they don't really see it. I mean, this is, and then we wonder why we don't see more outrage from the people that say they defend, undocumented immigrants and people who are being used. I mean, these people are being used and manipulated. Their bodies are being used. Their mental state, their everything is being manipulated for the gain of money.
of outside investors. So I actually just reviewed a agreement and all the way through how it actually was finalized. Most of the time, this stuff is behind the scenes. You're never even going to know that a case even had funding, let
I
alone know.
wanted about that too.
Let alone know what their agreement looks like. But there's certain circumstances where people actually have to disclose to the court, where exactly all the money is going and get court approval to distribute. That often happens with minors, and it also happens with estates. So I was just going through one where it was this guy had a case open and it dragged for 7 years. Well, every so often he's getting XYZ surgery. He passes away in the meantime. And ultimately, thereafter, they settle the case and it goes up to the court for approval to approve the distributions. The funder took over half of the recovery. By the time you took out the funding, the medical liens, and the attorney's fees, the estate got 3% of the settlement funds, $15,000. After
Oh my.
7 years, multiple surgeries, case prolonged past the man's death, the estate got $15,000. The funder got hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And let's talk about this, Dan. A lot of people, I want to make sure people understand that third litigation funding, we don't see this in the settlements. It doesn't have to be disclosed. There's movement to try to change that. But, everybody is sort of at a disadvantage when certainly journalists trying to investigate it, attorneys trying to defend. Let's talk to people a little bit about how all of this, some of this financial stuff you've uncovered, but there's a lot of it that's still in the dark.
Most of it's still in the dark. Even the basic necessities to start putting these things together are only by happenstance and deep, deep investigation. Yeah, this is not stuff that's disclosed. If you're in an injury case, if you're the defendant, you have to, by law, automatically disclose, I have this insurance with this carrier for this amount. Plaintiff does not have to disclose whether or not they have litigation funding, which I get in theory again when we're coming from the position of these are good actors. But if they're not, this is freewheeling Wild West. They don't have to disclose the fact it exists. Even if you demand it in discovery, unless particular circumstances are met, the court will deny it. They will protect it. They will keep it in the dark from you. And what really drives me crazy is just that there is such a simple fix that for some reason just never gets addressed. Nobody wants to talk about it, and it never catches any traction, which is at the end of a case, at the end of an injury case, the attorneys have to file something that's called a closing statement with the Office of Court Administration. And that document has to lay out and be substantiated by each and every piece of that settlement where that money goes. Who was cut what check for what amount? And it has to be filled out entirely. So even if there's 100 people who took pieces out of that settlement, you have to document each one and how much they took. You have to document how much your ultimate fee was. You have to document how much you actually paid out to the plaintiff. But again, most importantly, it shows you here's where all the money went. Now, that sounds great. Cool. You have an excellent, excellent check and balance put into place there that the Office of Court Administration receives these on every case. That must make it extremely transparent and very easy to investigate misconduct. Yeah, not so much. This is the only document that not only do you have to go to court to get permission to see even one of them, you can't go to a regular court. You have to go to the presiding justice of the appellate department wherein your case sits. So if I'm in a court, if I'm looking into a case in the Bronx and I think, wow, I think something sketchy went on. Good thing the government collects this information. I have to go to the presiding appellate judge of the first department and get authority from him to inspect, or her, to inspect one of these from one case. Now, when you're talking about systemic level harm that operates at scale, think about how much this is just a complete and utter roadblock from doing any form of legitimate investigation. Now,
Why do you think? I mean, we'll keep it, let's not get too conspiracy theory here, but no, look, we see this as journalists, we see this all the time. There are things that in theory you're like, this is great, this is going to be good, I'm going to get access, and then you realize there what seems to be a totally irrational procedure in place. And what does a rational person do, which I try to be every now and then? You think, why is that there? Why is that block there?
argument would be that it's to protect privacy concerns, that the public generally should not have easy, ready access to knowing who got paid what for someone's medical treatment. I can understand that. But there's a whole other system in place for that that gets handled in every single underlying case. There's a reason that there's HIPAA. There's a reason that there's HIPAA authorizations. But that HIPAA authorization, even if I'm on the case as the defendant in the underlying case, if I get that HIPAA authorization, it still doesn't get me access to that document. That document is more protected than virtually any other kind of document, including medical records in the state of New York. I would have an easier time getting documents from an ongoing investigation from the police than it would be for me to get this document. Oh, it is the only document that I'm aware of that does not, a so ordered subpoena from a sitting judge would not get you. That you have to go to the appellate department, not just any judge in the appellate department, the presiding judge. That system is,
And can they still decide not to release it
yeah, yeah.
under
And
their judicial
and you have to
discretion?
be
Right.
sophisticated enough to know that this is even a process that exists. This is not something that's typical and standard, and it's also not typical and standard for a government document, period. This is still documentation that's gathered by the Office of Court Administration. That is a government document. The fact that there's this outrageously high bar to sit there and go and collect what should be public information is absurd. And the fact that no one's looked at this as maybe we should change that. This is what's letting people walk out of the store with the merchandise. Like you've got the cameras, they're taking footage, but you're refusing to let anyone look at them.
Okay, bring me through what's next for you. We know that you're always, I know you can tease something. I don't know if there's something you're working on you want us to keep an eye on down the pipeline, anything that keeps you up at night. We all know how passionate you are about this. Is there anything that is sort of on the forefront that you either you're working on or you think people should be paying attention to?
You've known me long enough. I unfortunately have an addiction to picking up the sword and wanting to fight everyone about, things that I think are right. But the reality is
I get it.
you can only win so many single battles and effectuate large scale change. That large scale change only comes when people start paying attention, start demanding answers, and start going to people who can make systemic change. I can't fight every single case in court. I have to, make larger pushes to develop further awareness, general awareness that these are things that are happening. And the problem is, number one, you've got people who are suffering the most direct, individualized harm from these scams. Yeah, these are people who are afraid to speak up. These are people who, often don't speak English. They're often, very recent immigrants. They're often, minimum wage or less workers. And there are people who are also afraid in our current environment that if they go and they talk about these things, they're opening themselves up for problems. And that's a dynamic that's actually preyed upon That's why these are the people who are being pulled in to go through these paces. Because what are they going to say? What are they going to do? Not only that, they know that they've gotten money for doing something that's probably wrong. I don't put any blame on them, honestly. These are people doing the best they can and, who otherwise don't have access to this type of money or, quote unquote opportunity. And most of these people are just trying to do right, for their family and to get by. They're to me not culpable to nearly the degree as anyone else involved. You know who is? The people who are sitting there pooling their money together in investments and effectively controlling the roulette wheel that has people's lives on it. That to me is egregious. And the doctors that assist, especially the surgeons, in making these schemes come to fruition. I mean, people who take oaths that they just treat, arbitrarily. I don't appreciate.
This is important to you. Everything that you do, you take very seriously. You are in this. Do you think there will ever be a moment where, what do you want to see change? If you could get one thing changed, would it be that on the closing statement or making closing statements actually publicly available with some ease?
I mean, I would love for that to change. I think that would make things much, much more transparent. You can still have protections in place. Make it subject to a HIPAA. That's fine. Yeah, do what you have to do to make sure those records, are protected in terms of data that's sensitive. But there is no reason for these to be under the equivalent of Fort Knox in a way that no other document is, when it is supposed to exist for purposes of transparency and accountability, and is the surest and simplest way to put together the scale and extent of some of the things that are being done. I've only managed to get my hands on two closing statements, two,
You only two?
two, and both of them had misconduct. 100% of the massive two closing statements I've managed to get my hands on, one had related parties that were basically asserting false loans that didn't exist. That these were people who were employees of the law firm that prosecuted the case. The other one had what was it? I don't remember. There was something else. I've seen too much stuff at this point. But there was something else about money basically being diverted to an interested party. But the fact is that I've only managed to get my hands on two of them, and both of them demonstrated misconduct, demonstrated diversion of monies. Like, why is it so hard to get our hands on it? It has to just be to protect the system that's in place. Too many people are getting paid. Too many people are having a go with this. It supports a large part of the economy at this point.
And you believe that some of this money is international money.
I have no doubt, and I know that it's international money. I know funders that are directly backstopped by foreign private equity. They haven't even stopped there. There's private equity that own a whole chain of the clinics that you see in all these cases. It's a private equity firm in Bahrain is behind those clinics. It's absurd the degree to which international finance has permeated what people really have no idea they even have a hand in. You walk down, Roosevelt Ave and you see these shady rundown clinics that you're like, "Well, who would even go in there?" They're owned by private equity firms in Bahrain, and they're churning out money. They are churning out money. It's happening all day, all around us in ways people don't even know.
Anything else you want people to know? Anything at all? I mean, I know we could go on, but anything else that you think is important?
I think the most important thing is to just people need to care. People need to care. It's real easy to, and I totally understand the appeal of just going about your life and just, I have my family, I go to work, I come home, I take care of that, I get my paycheck, I vote in the elections, and that's, that's what I do. And something that's happening with, someone who's an immigrant who I don't even speak his language, and I'm not part of that community, and I don't know what's going on with them. It's not my problem. Or, oh, well, they're making money. These lawyers are making money that's winding up overseas. What does that have to do with me? Like, people have to start connecting the dots and waking up and realizing that all of this is connected. The amount of fraud we have in New York in particular is outrageous. By some estimates, what, 95 billion just in court waste from fraud and fraudulent cases. That's an obscene, obscene number for just a state. just a state, let alone, we just had recently a release of Medicaid data for the past 6 years. That's $3 trillion worth of Medicaid payments, where they reasonably estimate north of 20% is due to fraud.
I know, and our schools need funding,
Oh,
and our roads, and our homeless and affordable housing, and this money could be going to so many good causes.
all of that money could be going to good causes. And on top of that, the problem that it really gives me is that you have all these cases that come in and wind up clogging up the docket and causing problems and delaying justice for people who are actually there for the right reasons and are there to get justice. And when these get clogged up due to the greed of attorneys and doctors who treat their oaths like toilet paper, this is unacceptable to me. I'm not going to stop until people are in prison. I'm not going to stop until the laws are changed. And until people realize this is the reason it is impossible to afford to live in New York.
Dan Johnston, thank you so much for coming on. Amazing.
Awesome.